The water was already at her knees when they told her to get back. Esther Drayne stood in the middle of the Duke of Aldermere's best 300 acres, the Longholt they called it, and watched a whole year's wheat go under. Brown water, flat and patient. It moved so slow you could not see it move, and that was the trick of it. That was the lie the land told. The stalks bent, then bowed, then were gone, and the flood did not hurry once. Up on the dry lane, the estate men waved their arms at her. "Get back, girl, back to the ditch." That was where her sort belonged, they meant. Down in the cut with a spade, not out here in a gentleman's field with an opinion. She did not argue. She never argued. Arguing was a thing you did when you thought words would win, and Esther had learned young that they did not. So she said nothing. She only knelt. She put her hand flat on the surface of the water, palm down, the way her father had taught her before she could read, and she felt for the pull of it. Water always wants to go somewhere. It has a road, even when you have buried the road, and under her hand, cold and certain, the Longholt was telling her exactly which way it wished to run. Nobody up on the lane was listening to the water. They were listening to 3 men from London. Prowse, Catchpole, Ainsworth, Surveyors, all 3, with brass theodolites on wooden legs and maps rolled under their arms and boots that had never once been wet. They had come up on the coach with letters of reference and a fee agreed in advance, and they had spent 4 days squinting through their instruments at land they did not understand. Now they were folding their maps. They folded them slow, in front of everyone, the way a doctor draws the sheet up over a face. 40 tenants stood watching. The land agent stood watching, and Silas Prowse, chief of the 3, cleared his throat and said the words that would decide whether 40 families kept a roof come winter. "The Longholt is beyond drainage," he said. "The estate must be let go. Beyond drainage." 2 words. A death sentence for 300 acres and everything that leaned on them. And as he passed her. As Silas Prowse walked back toward the dry lane and his warm coach, stepping careful around the edge of the flood so as not to soil his boots, he looked down at Esther Drayne on her knees with her hand in the water, and he did not even slow. "Water answers to instruments, girl," he said, "not to ditch water breeding." She kept her hand where it was. She did not look up, but she had already seen what he had not, because he read dials and she read water, and the 2 of them were not measuring the same world at all. That night, in a cottage on the edge of the fen, Esther Drayne unrolled a length of oilcloth her father had kept hidden for 20 years. Cracked at the folds. Yellow with age. A thing the whole village would have called an old man's rubbish if they had ever been let see it. On it, drawn in a careful hand long ago, was the old Waters Road, where the fen wanted to drain, before someone changed it. And far across the dark fields, at a high window of a house he rarely left, Adrian Vane, Duke of Aldermere, a man who had not walked down to his own water in 20 years, and would not tell you why, saw a single lantern moving out on the drowned holt, low and slow, where no lantern had any business being. He did not know whose it was. Not yet. If you have ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, if you have ever known more than the important men in the room and been waved back to the ditch anyway, then this story is for you. Before we go on, do one small thing for me. Subscribe so the next chapter finds you. And tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight. I read every one, and I like to know where in the world we are all sitting when this story reaches us. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Esther Drayne was born in a ditcher's cottage on the edge of the Aldermere fens, and she learned to read water before she learned her letters. Her father set her on the bank when she was small, both of them muddy to the elbow, and he taught her the way you teach a thing you love. Not with books. With the back of your hand and the flat of your palm and long hours of doing nothing but looking. "Watch how it lies in the low places," he would say. "Watch where it goes quick and where it sulks. Land tips, Esther, Every field tip somewhere, even the ones that look dead level to a lazy eye. Find the tip, and you find the drain. His name was Jonah. He had hands like knotted rope, and a silence that had grown on him like moss. He had not always been so quiet. There were old people in the fen who remembered him laughing, back before. But that was before the year they called the Great Drowning, and after the Great Drowning, Jonah Drayne mostly stopped speaking, and the village mostly stopped speaking to him, and the two silences had settled in together for 20 years. Esther grew up inside that quiet. She grew up the ditcher's daughter, which in the fen was a low thing to be, and the daughter of the disgraced ditcher, which was lower still. Children learn early what a village has decided about them. She learned it in the way mouths went flat when she passed. She learned it in church, 3 pews back from where the decent families sat. She learned it, most of all, in the way nobody would meet her father's eye, as if his shame might rub off through a look. But she also learned the fens, and that, it turned out, was a thing the village could not take from her. By the time she was grown, she could walk a wet field and tell you in 10 minutes what a London man could not tell you in 10 days, where the old cuts ran under the reeds, where the peat had sunk and the water pooled, where a spade put in just here and not there would pull an acre dry by morning. The fen families knew it too. They would not sit beside the drains in church, but when their bottom meadow flooded and their one cow stood belly deep and bawling, it was Esther they sent a boy to fetch, quiet, after dark, so the neighbours would not see. She never once said no. She would go out in the rain with her father's tools, and she would find the water's road, and she would open it. And by dawn the meadow would be drying, and the cow would be up on the grass, and nobody would thank her where anyone might hear. That was her whole life, near enough. Useful in the dark, invisible in the light. And she had told herself for so long that invisible was the same as safe that she had stopped being able to tell the two apart. The land she lived on belonged to the Duke of Aldermere, and in that year the land was drowning. It had been a wet spring and a wetter summer. The dikes stood full and then overfull. The lower fields went first, and then the middling ones, and by August the water had crept up into the long holt itself, the 300 acres of good high wheat that were meant to be the making of the estate that year. Meant to be. Because the estate needed making. The estate was in trouble, the like of which a tenant only heard in whispers. £40,000. That was the number, though most of the fens said it under their breath as if the size of it were indecent. £40,000 owed to the banking house of Corbett and Slade, borrowed by the old Duke and grown heavier every year since, the way debt does. And there was a day coming when the bank would want its answer. The Michaelmas rent audit, when the estate's books were opened and its worth was reckoned against what it owed. If the long holt came in, if 300 acres of wheat were cut and sold, the estate could meet its year and hold on. If the holt drowned, the audit would show a hole no rent could fill. And Corbett and Slade would foreclose, and the whole of Aldermere would be sold from under the people who worked it. 40 families. That was what the number really meant, if you turned it over. 40 families who would lose their livings in a single quarter day. The Sedgwicks and the Marches, and the old widow Puttock, and all the rest. Esther knew every one of them by name. She knew which had a new baby, and which had a boy just old enough to be some use, and which had nobody left but an old man and a lame horse. When she stood on the bank and watched the holt go under, she did not see acres, she saw kitchens going cold. The Duke, they said, would not come and look at it himself. He never came to look at anything on the waterside of his own estate. He had not ridden the fens in 20 years, not since. Well, not since. People let the sentence hang, and nobody in Esther's hearing had ever finished it, and she had not thought it her place to ask. His man came instead. His man came for everything. Mr. Hulme was the land agent, and he was the sort of man the fen distrusted on sight without being able to say quite why. Smooth, neat, a soft voice and a softer hand. He managed the estate for the Duke, kept its ledgers, spoke for it in every matter, and he had lately fallen into the habit of saying, in that mild, reasonable way of his, that perhaps the kindest thing, the sensible thing, would be to let the whole place go to the bank and be done. Cut the losses. Spare everyone the agony. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided and only wants the room to agree to. What the Fen did not know, what Esther did not know, not yet, was that Mr. Hulme stood to do very well out of a sale to Corbett and Slade, quietly, on his own account, and that in a locked drawer of his office there were old drainage ledgers, going back a generation, in which certain entries had been written in a careful, dishonest hand, and which he had every confidence no one would ever open again. Among her father's things, in the cottage, there was a roll of oilcloth. It lived up on the high shelf over the hearth, and it had lived there Esther's whole life, and she had never once seen him take it down. When she was small she asked about it, and he said nothing, which was his answer to most things. When she was older and cleaning she moved to take it down and dust it, and he crossed the room faster than she had seen him move in years and put his hand over hers on it, and said, "Lo, leave it," and she left it. The neighbours, on the rare times one came inside, would glance at the roll and glance away. "Old Jonah's rubbish," they'd say after, in the lane. "Bit of stuff he won't burn. Cracked mind, cracked man, he keeps rubbish." It was not rubbish. But it would be a while yet before anyone alive learned that, and by then it would matter more than the whole estate. The 3 surveyors came up from London on a Tuesday. They arrived in the agent's own trap, Mr. Hulme handing them down one by one, and the Fen turned out to watch the way it turns out for a funeral or a fair. Prowse first, a broad, certain man with side whiskers and a watch chain, and a way of standing as if the ground were lucky to have him. Then Catchpole, thin and busy, forever writing. Then Ainsworth, the young one, who mostly did what the other 2 told him and looked anxious about it. They had a cart of instruments behind, brass and mahogany, legs and lenses, things that gleamed. Esther was in the ditch when they came, because she was almost always in the ditch. She was cutting back a fallen bank in the drain that ran along the Holtslow edge up to her thighs in cold water, and she went on cutting while the great men set up their tripods on the dry ground above her and squinted at the flood through their glasses and called numbers to one another that Catchpole wrote down. She listened, you could not help but listen, and the more she listened, the colder something in her chest went, colder than the ditch water. Because they were reading it wrong. She could see it. She could see it the way you see a man about to step off a roof he thinks is a floor. They had decided, all 3, that the Holt drained toward the eastern dyke, that the fall of the land ran that way, and they were laying out their whole plan on it, stakes going in along the east, marking where a new cut would go. And it was wrong. It was precisely wrong. The Holt did not fall east. It fell west and a little south, toward the old reed-choked corner that everybody had forgotten, because a long time ago someone had filled the cut that used to carry it there. Her hand had told her so, out in the flood. Her father's whole map, though she had not yet unrolled it, would have told her so. The water wanted west, and these 3 men were about to spend the estate's last hope digging east into rising ground where the flood would only back up and drown deeper. She should have kept quiet. Quiet was safe. Quiet was what she was. But there were 40 families in it, and she was tired, and before she had decided to, she had straightened up in the ditch, with the water running off her arms, and she had said it. "You've got the fall backwards," she said. "It don't drain east, it drains to the west corner. Stake it east, and you'll drown it worse." The silence that came after was its own kind of flood. Catchpole stopped writing. Ainsworth went red. Prowse turned, slow, and looked down at her, at the mud on her, at the man's boots she wore, at the patched dress kilted up out of the water, at the whole low fact of her, and he smiled the way a man smiles at a dog that has done a trick. "Did the ditch speak?" he said, and the young one laughed, nervous, because he thought he was meant to. Esther said it again, because it was true, and true was the only weapon she had ever been given. "West corner. There's an old cut under the reeds there. It's the low point. I felt it. You've felt it," said Prowse. He said the word as if it were something crawling. "You've felt it. Madam, I have measured it. There is a difference, though I would not expect you to grasp it, between a science and a superstition. Water answers to instruments." He turned back to his tripod. "It does not answer to feelings, and it does not answer to the daughters of ditchers. Now, stand out of my sight line." She stood out of his sight line. She got down in the ditch and moved along it, out of his way, and she felt the old heat behind her eyes, and she did not let it come. She had had a lifetime of practice at not letting it come. But she had a piece of chalk in her apron, the fat white chalk she used to mark stakes, and as she worked her way west along the drain, past the very stakes the Londoners had just driven, she took it out, and on each of their East Line stakes, quiet, without a word, she made a small white cross, one after another, a cross for every stake that stood where the water would rise. She marked the whole doomed line of them, low down near the mud, where a gentleman's eye would never think to look. Then she put the chalk away and climbed out and walked home, and she did not look back. And the great men never noticed she had signed their work for them. The Holt kept rising for 4 more days. It rose along the east exactly as she had said it would, and it drowned each of Prowse's stakes in turn, and on each drowned stake, just under the brown water if you knew to look, was a small white cross going soft and pale as the flood swallowed it. They surrendered on the 5th day, in front of everyone. Mr. Hulme had seen to it that everyone was there. That was the thing Esther understood only later, that the agent wanted a public death, a death with witnesses, so that no one could ever say afterward the estate might have been saved. He gathered the tenants to the field on a pretext of hearing the surveyor's report. 40 of them stood along the lane in the grey morning, caps in hands, and a carriage stood a little apart, up the lane, dark and closed, with a crest on the door, and word ran down the line in whispers that the Duke himself was inside it, that Adrian Vane had come this far and no farther, would sit behind glass and hear his estate pronounced dead, but would not set his boot upon the ground to see it. Esther stood at the back, as she always stood at the back. Her father had not come. Her father never came to anything, and Silas Prowse, before the tenants and the agent and the shut black carriage, folded his maps. He did it grandly. He let the pause stretch. Then he gave his verdict, loud, so it would carry, so no one could mistake it. "We have surveyed the Long Holt by every instrument known to the profession," he said. "The land will not drain. The cost would exceed the worth 10 times over. It is our considered judgment, and we will set our names to it, that the Holt is beyond drainage, and that this estate, in honesty, must be let go." A sound went along the line of tenants. Not a cry, softer and worse than a cry. The sound of 40 people hearing the roof come off. And out on the field, where Prowse pointed to prove his point, his own stakes stood drowned in a flat brown sheet of water, row on row, going under, and on each one, if any of those great men had thought to wade out and look, which none of them ever would, there was the ghost of a small white cross, marking to the inch where the flood had risen exactly as a ditcher's daughter had told them it would, 4 days before their instruments ever agreed. The carriage did not open, but behind the glass, though no one on the lane could see it, a grieving man watched his brother's fields go under a second time, and something in him that had been asleep for 20 years turned over in its sleep. They said the estate had 40 days. 40 days from the surrender to the Michaelmas audit. 40 days for a miracle, and no miracle to be had. For the experts had spoken, and the experts were gone back to London with their fee, and Mr. Hulme was already writing his soft letters to Corbett and Slade, about terms of sale. The fen went about in a daze. Men who had been born on Aldermere land and expected to die on it now stood in their doorways of an evening and did not know what to do with their hands. It was Tom Sedgwick who carried the word to the house. Tom was a fen tenant, a good one, broad and honest and slow to speak, and he had a soft spot for Esther Drayne that half the fen knew about, and Esther pretended not to. He would have wed her tomorrow, disgrace and all. He had as good as said so, in his roundabout way, more than once, and Tom, who trusted Esther the way the fen secretly trusted her, in the dark, said the thing out loud that nobody with any standing would say. He said it to the house steward, and the steward, having nothing left to lose, said it to Mr. Hulme, and Mr. Hulme, who wanted very much for it not to be said at all, was unable to stop it reaching the one man it needed to reach. The ditcher's girl says otherwise. The ditcher's girl says the Holt can be drained. She marked where the London men's stakes would drown, and every one of them drowned where she marked it. Adrian Vane heard it on a Thursday evening, alone in a study he rarely left, and for the first time in 20 years he ordered a horse and rode down toward his own water. He came to the cottage after dark. Esther heard the horse and thought it was a tenant in trouble, some flooded meadow, some bawling cow, and she was already reaching for her father's tools when the knock came, and it was not a tenant's knock. It was too even, too sure. She opened the door with the tools still in her hand, and there on the low step, stooping under the lintel, was the Duke of Aldermere. She had never been so close to him. Nobody in the fen had. He was younger than she had pictured him, and worse worn, 34, but with grey already coming at the temples, and a stillness in his face that she knew, because it was the same stillness her father wore. Grief that had set like plaster. He looked past her into the mean little room. At the earth floor, and the one candle, and the old man silent by the hearth, and Esther felt the whole weight of what she was drop onto her shoulders the way it always did in front of the grate. Waved back to the ditch. Ditch water breeding. She squared herself for it. She got ready to be small. "They tell me," the Duke said, "that you say the Holt can be drained." She had been ready for scorn, and here was a plain question, and it threw her worse than scorn would have. She heard her own voice come out flatter than she meant. "I do say it, sir. 3 surveyors say it cannot." 3 surveyors read it east, she said. "It falls west." He looked at her a long moment, not at her dress. She noticed that even then, in the middle of everything, that his eyes did not do the thing men's eyes always did, the flick down over the patches and the mud and the man's boots, the little accounting of how low she was. He looked at her face as if her face were the thing that would answer his question. It was so strange to her that she nearly missed her chance in the wonder of it. Then she thought of the 40 kitchens going cold, and she turned and reached up over the hearth, past her father, who made a sound, low, half a word of protest, and she took down the oilcloth for the first time in her life. "Esther," her father said. One word, 20 years of silence in it. "They mean to sell it, father," she said. Quiet. "It's that or this." She cleared the table with her arm and unrolled the oilcloth flat and set the candle to it. And there it was, the Old Waters Road. Drawn in a young man's careful hand a generation gone, Jonah Drayne's hand, when Jonah Drayne was a man the estate trusted, before the drowning, before the silence. Every cut and drain and fall of the fen as it had truly been. And running plain across the Longholt, marked in faded ink, was a cut that no longer existed on any of the estate's newer maps. A cut through the west corner. The low road. The way the water had gone before someone filled it in. The Duke bent over the map. Esther bent over it from the other side to hold the corner flat against the draught, and their 2 heads came into the small ring of candlelight together, closer than she had ever been to a man of his rank, and neither of them moved away. The lantern of it, the little warm island of light with the old secret laid open between them, She would remember it after as the first thing, the first centimetre of a distance she did not yet know she was crossing. "This cut," he said. His finger hovered over the faded west line, not quite touching, as if it might be hot. "This is not on the estate maps." "No, sir, someone took it off. Someone filled it." She kept her voice even, the tradesman's voice, the voice you use when the truth is enough and you must not let it shake. "The water's been looking for that road 20 years. That's why it drowns where it drowns. Open the west cut and the Holt drains itself. It wants to. It's been wanting to." He was quiet so long she thought she had lost. She had seen that quiet in great men before, the quiet just before the door shuts. Then he straightened, and she saw his jaw work, and she saw, she would swear to it after, that his hand where it rested on the edge of the table was not quite steady. 40 days, he said. "I can give you 40 days, and every man on the estate who'll follow a ditcher's daughter, which may not be many. I can give you the tools and the timber. I can promise you nothing, because there is nothing left to promise with. If you fail, we are sold, and you will have failed in front of everyone who told you that you would." He looked at her. "Do you still say it can be done?" "I don't say things I've not felt," Esther said. "I felt it. It can be done." "Then do it," said the Duke of Aldermere, and he rolled the oilcloth up himself. "Careful, gentle. The way you handle a thing you have understood is precious," and he handed it back to her across the candle. Their fingers did not touch. They very nearly touched, and behind them, by the hearth, old Jonah Drayne sat with his ruined hands over his face and wept without any sound at all, because after 20 years someone with power had finally looked at his map and believed it. They did not know it yet, either of them, but the map did not only show where the water wanted to go, it showed who had lied, and a man in a neat office some miles off was sleeping easy over ledgers he was sure no one would ever open. The great people came within the week to put a stop to it. They came because that is what the great people do when one of their own steps off the path. The Dowager Duchess, Adrian's aunt, Constance, a straight-backed old woman with a face like a closed account and a lifelong faith in what people would say, arrived at the house with a companion, and the companion was Miss Cassandra Ferrars. Miss Ferrars was the daughter of the banking house. Pretty, mild, correct in every stitch. And Miss Ferrars came with a dowry that would all by itself clear a good part of the £40,000 if only the Duke would do the sane thing, the sensible thing, the thing everybody advised, and marry her. That was the cure they pressed on him. Not drainage. Marriage, sell the Holt to the bank, wed the bank's daughter, and let the ditcher's girl go back to her ditch where she could do no more harm. Aunt Constance said it plainly, over dinner, in the certain voice of a woman who had never once been contradicted by an outcome. Miss Ferrars said it more softly, and perhaps more kindly, for she was not a cruel girl, only a well-trained one, and the Rules, wearing an old face and a young one both, sat at the Duke's table and waited for him to be reasonable. He did not give them an answer. He went out, instead, in the grey mornings, down to the long Holt where his surveyors had run, and he watched a ditcher's daughter work. That was the thing that undid the reasonable plan, in the end, though it took its time. He watched her hands. She had her father's brass level now, a plain, worn old instrument. A labourer's tool that the Londoners would not have deigned to touch, and she set it up on the bank and sighted along it, and read the fall of the land the way the great men had read it wrong. And where they had measured, she confirmed. Everything her hand had told her in the flood, the old brass level now told her again in figures, and the figures agreed with the water and disagreed with London. She stood in the field she had been waved out of, and she proved, quietly, morning after morning, exactly which way the Holt fell, west and a little south toward the buried corner, and why the surveyor's east plan would have drowned it deeper. And one by one the tenants who came to watch, arms folded, ready to sneer, stopped sneering. Tom Sedgwick was first. Then the Marches, then old men, who had not given Jonah Drayne a civil word in 20 years, found themselves, to their own surprise, doing what a Drayne told them to do, and finding it worked. The Duke watched all of it from the top of the bank, always from the top of the bank. And Esther, whose whole life had trained her to notice exactly where a person would and would not put their feet, began to notice something about him that no one else seemed to see. He never came down to the water. He would ride to the field. He would walk the dry lane. He would stand on the high bank in the wind with his hands behind his back and watch her work below him for an hour together. But he never once stepped down onto the wet margin, onto the black, shining edge where the flood met the land. When the work moved to the water's edge, he stopped, always a few feet short, as if there were a wall there that only he could see. The tenants thought nothing of it. A duke does not wade. But Esther had spent her life reading the ground people were afraid to stand on, and she knew fear when she saw it wear a fine coat. This was not idleness. This was not pride. This was a man who could not make himself go near the water, and she thought, she was almost sure, that it had to do with the thing nobody in the fen would ever finish saying. Not since. Not since. She did not shame him with it. That was the thing she decided, standing in the mud one morning, watching him stop short at the top of the bank for the 10th time. She could have. A word would have done it. Instead, she simply arranged the work so that it never asked him to come down. She sent the tools up to him. She read her levels from where he stood. She built the whole business, quietly, around a wound she had no name for, and she never once let him see that she had seen it. It was the kindest thing she had ever done for anyone, and she did it for a duke, and neither of them ever spoke a word about it. Then, on a hot, still afternoon in the yard, old Jonah went down. He had come out to watch, a rare thing, for he almost never left the cottage, and he was standing in the sun by the gate when his legs simply folded, the way an old wall folds, all at once and without warning. Esther cried out and ran. But the Duke was nearer. Adrian Vane crossed the yard in 4 strides and went down on one knee in the dirt beside the old man, and then, before his own aunt, who had come out onto the step, before Miss Ferrers, before a yard full of tenants, the Duke of Aldermere put his arms under Jonah Drayne and lifted him clean up off the ground. The disgraced ditcher, the man his family had blamed for 20 years for the death of his own brother. He carried him, a duke's arms cradling the ruin of the man his house had ruined, across the whole yard and in through the low cottage door, gentle as if he carried something holy, and laid him on the bed. Aunt Constance made a sound on the step like a kettle. It was not done. It was so far from done that there was no word for how far from done it was. A Vane did not touch a Drayne. A Vane did not lift a Drayne against his own chest in front of the county. Adrian Vane straightened up in the low room, breathing hard, and looked across the bed at Esther, and Esther looked back at him, and neither of them could have told you what had just passed between them. There was no name for it. There was only the old man breathing on the bed and the two of them standing over him in the dim, and something in the air of that cottage that had not been there an hour before and would never quite leave again. The audit was 20 days off. The water had begun, barely an inch, but truly to fall along the west line exactly as her father's map had promised. The tenants believed. The Duke would not marry the bank. And out in his neat office, Mr. Hulme the agent looked at the falling water and the failing sail and the ditcher's daughter who was ruining everything, and he began, quietly, to think about the sluice gate, the one gate that held the whole scheme together, and about how a gate might fail without anyone ever being able to prove a hand had touched it. Esther knew none of that. What Esther knew was that the falling inch was not enough, and would not be enough in time, unless she did the one thing the experts had sworn could not be done, and everyone but a handful of fenfolk still swore was madness. The old cut. The buried west cut on her father's map. The road the water had been looking for these 20 years. It was still there under the reeds and the fill, and if she opened it, if she cut a relief drain by night, with fen hands and fen spades, straight down the faded line no living surveyor would sign his name to, the Holt would drain itself in days instead of drowning for a season. It was the whole gamble. It was her father's name and her own, staked on water that 3 credentialed men had sworn upon their instruments would never move. She stood in the dark at the edge of the west corner with the brass level in her hand, and Tom Sedgwick and a dozen fenmen behind her, spades on their shoulders, waiting on her word. She could still say no. She could still be small and safe and invisible, the way she had been her whole life, the way that had kept her breathing. She put the point of her spade to the line her father had drawn a generation ago, and she pushed it into the earth, and she began to dig the road back open. Behind her, up on the high bank where he could not make himself come down, the Duke of Aldermere lifted a lantern in the dark to light her work, and miles across the black fen. In a locked drawer he was certain no one would ever open, the truth of what had really drowned his brother lay, waiting for the water to find it. The first spadeful came up black and heavy, and it smelled of things that had not seen air in 20 years. Esther set it aside and cut again. Behind her the fenmen found their rhythm. Spade, lift, turn, spade. The old sound of the fen, the sound she had been born to. Nobody spoke. Tom Sedgwick worked at her shoulder, and when her wrists tired, he took the deeper cuts without being asked. Up on the high bank, the lantern held steady. The Duke did not come down. She had stopped expecting him to. By the 3rd night, the trench ran the length of a hayfield. By the 4th it met the reeds, and there, under a foot of grey fill, her father's line showed itself, a seam of old peat, packed hard, laid down by hands long dead. The road the water had been looking for. She knelt and pressed her palm to it, and felt it cold and true, and something in her chest went loose that had been tight since she was a girl. "It's here," she said. "It's just where he drew it." Tom leaned on his spade. "Then we're mad in good company." She almost laughed. She had not laughed in weeks. The water began to fall. It was not much at first. An inch, then another inch, measured against a stake she drove at the ditch mouth each dawn. But the tenants saw it. Word ran through the fen the way water runs, quiet, then everywhere at once. Men who had crossed the lane to avoid Jonah Drayne's daughter now came at dusk with their own spades. Women brought bread and cold tea and did not ask to be thanked. By the 10th day there were 40 hands on the cut, and the Long Holt, 300 acres pronounced dead before witnesses, was giving up its water field by field. The Duke came at dawn one morning when the mist still lay flat on the ground. He came on foot, which she had never seen. He walked the top of the bank the way he always walked it, keeping the high line, his boots never nearing the wet. She watched him from below and understood, as she had come to understand, that this was not idleness and it was not pride. It was the water. He could not go near it. 20 years, and he still could not put his boot to the edge of the thing that had taken his brother. She climbed up to him rather than make him come down. "It's falling faster than I promised," she said. "If the weather holds, we'll have the west 3rd dry inside the week." He looked out over the fields. His face did what it always did, held still, gave nothing. But then he said, quietly, "My father's men told me it could not be done. Prowse told me. Every man I ever paid to know told me." He turned to her. "And a ditcher's daughter did it with a spade and her father's map. It's not done yet." "No," he said. "But it will be. I find that I believe you." He said it as though the believing surprised him. There was a wind coming off the fen, thin and cold, and she had left her shawl at the cottage. She had not noticed until he took his own coat from his shoulders and laid it over her. A plain movement, no ceremony, the way a man covers a thing he does not want to see cold. It smelled of wood smoke and horse. She should have given it back. She did not. They stood on the bank a while longer, not touching, the coat between them like a spoken thing neither would say aloud, and below them the water went on quietly leaving the land. Miss Ferrars came the next afternoon. She came in a carriage with the dowager, and the two of them walked the dry garden while the fen worked the wet field beyond the wall. Esther saw them from a distance, the pale muslin, the parasol, the daughter of Corbett and Slade, who had been brought like a draft to be signed. Cassandra Ferrars was not unkind. That was the worst of it. She had a soft face and a soft laugh and £40,000 folded into her dowry, and she would clear the debt the way a sponge clears a slate, and no one would ever have to go down to the water again. Aunt Constance found Esther at the field wall. "You have done a clever thing," the old woman said. "I will not pretend otherwise. But cleverness is not the same as a place. Girl, my nephew owes £40,000 to a bank that will foreclose at the Michaelmas audit whether your ditch runs dry or not. Miss Ferrars's dowry answers that in an afternoon. Your ditch answers it in a harvest that has not happened and may not." She let that sit. Do not mistake his gratitude for anything a girl of your birth should build a hope on. Kindness costs a duke nothing. It would cost you everything. Esther kept her eyes on the water. "I'm not building a hope, my lady. I'm building a drain. See that you remember which. That night Tom Sedgwick asked her to marry him. He did it plainly, in the cottage doorway, cap in his hands. 'I've land enough for two and a name that was never dirtied,' he said. I'd not ask you to be small, Esther. I'd not ask you to be anything but what you are. You could stop climbing that bank to a man who'll never come down it. He was decent all the way through, and he was right, and she nearly said yes. She felt the yes rise in her throat like the safe thing it was, the whole of her small, careful life pulling her toward it. 'Give me till Michaelmas, Tom,' she said instead. 'Let me finish the water first.' He nodded slowly. He knew what the asking for time meant. He was too decent to pretend he didn't. 'Aye,' he said, 'till Michaelmas.' And he put his cap back on and went out into the dark, and she stood in the doorway and hated herself a little for the size of what she wanted. She did not know that miles across the black fen, in a locked office, Mr. Hulme was hating her far more. He had watched the water fall with a sick private fury. Every inch it dropped was money out of his pocket, the quiet advantage he had folded into the sale to Corbett and Slade, the sum no one would ever see in the honest ledgers because it did not live in the honest ledgers. He had the old drainage books in a locked drawer, the ones with the entries doctored 20 years ago, and he had been certain to the marrow that no one would ever open them. A drowned estate does not audit its own graves. But a saved one might. A saved one might start asking how it had drowned in the first place. So Mr. Hulme went out one night with a bar and a file to the main sluice gate, the one gate that held the whole scheme together, and he worked at the timbers where the wet would hide his hand, and he weakened the thing just enough that a hard rain would finish it. Let the fen girl's ditch run, let the storm take the gate, and when the Holt drowned a second time, it would drown for good, and no one would ever think to blame a file in the dark. The storm came on the night the Holt was nearly dry. It came the way autumn storms come to the fen, no warning, just a wall of it out of the northeast, the sky gone the colour of a bruise by 4 o'clock, and black by 6. Esther felt it in her teeth before she saw it. She had her father's warning in her, the old fen sense that reads a sky the way it reads water. She was at the cottage when the first gust hit the thatch, and she was out the door and running before her father had finished rising from his chair. "The gate," she said to no one. "It'll try the gate." The main sluice stood at the low end, where all the water gathered before it ran out to the sea drain. Hold that gate, and the falling water kept falling. Lose it, and the whole fen upstream would come down on the drained fields in a single black flood and undo 40 days in an hour. She ran the bank with a lantern guttering in the wind, and the rain came sideways and cold, and behind her she heard boots on the sodden ground, Tom, and 2 of the Sedgwicks, and then, impossibly, a horse. The Duke rode down the bank in the dark, down it, to the water. He came off the horse at the gate with his face like a man walking into fire, and she understood what it cost him, every step of it, the 20 years he was breaking with each stride toward the edge. He did not speak of it. He grabbed the winch beside her and threw his weight on it and shouted over the storm, "Tell me what to do." The gate was failing. She saw it in the lantern light, the timbers sprung wrong, the fastening gone at one corner where no honest wear would ever have taken it. She saw the bright scar of a file on wet oak, and knew in one cold instant that no storm had done this. But there was no time for the knowing. The water was already forcing the weak corner, a black seam of it punching through. And if it took the gate, it would take everything. "Hold the winch," she cried. "Hold it against me. I have to get under." She went down into the sluice. She went into the black water at the foot of the gate, waist deep, then chest, feeling with her hands the way her father had taught her to feel, not looking, there was nothing to see, reading the timber by touch, finding the sprung corner, driving a fen stake and a wedge into the gap with a mallet she could barely swing against the current. Above her the men held the winch, above them the Duke held the men, and she worked in the dark under the water with her father's whole trade in her 2 hands, and slowly, timber by timber, the gate held. It was there, wedged in the mud at the gate's foot where the water had scoured the old fill away, that her hand closed on something that was not a stake and not a stone. She brought it up into the lantern light. It was a marker, an old estate boundary stone, iron-capped, the kind that fixed a survey line. And cut into it, where the flood had at last uncovered what 20 years of fill had hidden, was a date and a mark she knew, her father's mark, the ditcher's mark. And beneath it, deeper, older, another hand's order carved shallow in the iron cap, the fill line. The instruction to close the cut, signed with the seal of the old Duke's agent and dated the spring before the great drowning of '48. She stood in the water and the rain and the wind, and she understood it all at once, the whole of it, 20 years falling into place like water finding its level. The cut had not been left open and neglected. It had been filled. Filled on the old agent's order, to reclaim a strip of grazing, to put a few more acres to the rent roll, filled against every warning her father would have given. Because her father had been the ditcher, and her father had known. And when the water lost its road, it did what water does. It went looking, it rose where it had never risen in the wet spring of '48, and it took the young Vane boy who was down at the edge where boys go, and it drowned him. And they had needed a name to hang it on. They had not hung it on the agent who signed the order, they had hung it on the ditcher who dug the fen, on Esther Drayne, who had warned them, who had been the one man in the county who could have told them exactly why the water came. Later, dried, wrapped, the storm passed, she spread her father's oilcloth on the cottage table by lantern light and laid the iron marker beside it, and she saw the 2 lines meet, the drawn road and the buried one, the same road. Her father sat across from her, half broken, near silent, the way he had sat for 20 years. "You didn't drown him, father," she said. Her voice would barely come. They buried the water's road, and the water only went looking for it. She put her hand over his ruined hand. It was never you. It was never once you. The old man's face moved. 20 years of it moved at once, and he made a sound she had never heard him make, and he wept the way old men weep, silently, the tears just running, and she held his hand and let him. But a duke had ridden down to the water in the dark, and a ditcher's daughter had been alone with him in the storm, and the fen has eyes even in the rain. By morning the county was talking. By afternoon the dowager had heard it 3 ways: a drowned estate, a dead brother, a mortgaged name, and the Duke of Aldermere waist deep in a flood at midnight beside a ditcher's girl. It was a scandal with everything in it, and it ran the way the flood would have run if the gate had gone. Esther did the only thing she knew how to do. She withdrew. She went to the house of her own accord before she could be sent for, and she stood in the great hall in her drying fen clothes before the Duke and his aunt and Miss Ferrars, and she said what she had come to say. The holt will be dry by the audit. The drain holds. The gate held. She kept her eyes level, though it cost her. You don't need me at the house, your grace, and my being here does you harm. I'll finish the water from the cottage. Let no one say the Duke of Aldermere kept a ditcher's daughter under his roof. I won't be the thing they ruin you with. And she turned and went out before he could answer, out the service door she had come in by, because she would not let them put her out of the front. Aunt Constance was satisfied. Miss Ferrars was gently relieved. And the Duke stood in his own hall and said nothing, and let her go, and hated himself for the letting. The days to the audit came down like a tide going out. Prowse was recalled to the county, not to certify anything, but to explain it away. He walked the lane past the drying holt with Hulme at his elbow, and the two of them built the story the county wanted. Luck. A wet year turned dry, a ditch dug in the right place by chance. The land was always going to fall that season, Prowse told the tenants who would listen. No skill in it. A blind sow finds an acorn. Hulme nodded along and spoke of the bank, and the sensible sale, and the folly of staking 40 families on a girl's guess, and a madman's map. The whispering county leaned toward the safe lie the way it always leans. It is easier, it costs nothing, and it lets everyone keep the shape of the world they already know. The dowager came to the Duke one last time. Marry the girl from the bank, she said. Clear the debt. Send the fen girl her wages and a fair word, and let the county forget by Christmas. Do the safe thing, Adrian. Do the thing your name needs. She softened, which was rare in her. I am not cruel. I am only old, and I know what people will say, and I know it outlives us all. He looked at her a long time. You know what they'll say, he said. You've never once asked what's true. Michaelmas came. The audit was held where audits are always held, but the whole of it moved, that year, to the field itself. Word had gone round, and no one would stay away. The bank clerk came from Corbett and Slade with his book and his inkhorn. Prowse came with Catchpole and Ainsworth, summoned by the Duke's own hand to a purpose none of them yet knew. Hulme came with his honest ledgers and his lie ready. Aunt Constance came, and Miss Ferrars, and 40 tenant families, and Tom Sedgwick, and Jonah Drayne on his daughter's arm. And they gathered at the top of the Longholt in the thin gold morning, at the field that had been pronounced dead before witnesses one wet afternoon that spring. It was dry. 300 acres, drained and gold and cut. The wheat stood in, stooks the length of it. The harvest in, the water gone quiet down a clean cut that ran along a line an old ditcher had drawn a generation ago. The relief drain ran clear. You could hear it in the still morning, the small living sound of water going where it was meant to go. The bank clerk walked the field. He counted the stooks. He opened his book, and he did his sums, and the sum came out, because a real harvest off 300 good acres is a real number, and it met the debt with a margin. He closed the book. The Duke stood at the head of the field, where every soul could hear him. The harvest meets the note, he said. The debt to Corbett and Slade is answered from this land, as land was always meant to answer it. He let it land. The Longholt is not for sale. There is no sale. Tell your house so, sir. The bank clerk inclined his head and put his book away, and Miss Ferrars's leverage, and her father's, and the whole quiet machine that had been built to swallow the estate, went out like a snuffed candle in front of everyone. Then the Duke turned to the 3 surveyors. You certified this land beyond drainage, he said. Before 40 witnesses you folded your maps and named it dead. You'll certify it now. Walk the cut, Mr. Prowse. Read me the fall of the land you swore could not fall. There was nothing else Prowse could do. To refuse was to confess. So he walked it, the chief London surveyor, in his good coat, down the length of a ditcher's drain, with a level offered to him that he did not need because his own eyes could read the water running downhill along the exact line he had said water would never take. Catchpole walked behind him, thin, saying nothing, and young Ainsworth walked white-faced at the rear, and at the foot of the field the three of them stood over the clean running cut, with the whole county watching. Esther stood by the drain with her father's brass level in her hand. Prowse looked at her. Some old arrogance tried to rise in him and could not find its feet. "The land," he began, "the season was—" "You told me water answers to instruments," Esther said. Quiet, she did not raise her voice. She had never once had to. Not to ditch water breeding. She looked down at the running drain, and then back at him, and she said the one dry thing she had earned the right to say. "The water kept better books than you did, sir." And she turned to her work, and left him standing there with it, and Catchpole took the certificate from his own case and signed it, and then Ainsworth signed it. The paper certifying the drainage of a fen the three of them had ridden up from London to declare a grave. Then Jonah Drayne's daughter laid the iron marker on the audit table. She laid it beside Hulme's honest ledgers, in front of the tenants and the Duke and the bank, and she read out the date and the fill line and the old agent's seal cut into the iron cap. And then, because a marker is only a stone until someone opens the book that matches it, she looked at Hulme and she said, "The old drainage ledgers, sir, the ones in your locked drawer. Not these. The other ones." Hulme's face went the colour of tallow. The Duke had already sent for them. Two of the fen men brought them up from the office where the drawer had been broken open at his order that dawn, and they were laid open on the table beside the marker, and the two agreed, the doctored entries and the iron order, the fill that closed the cut, dated the spring before the drowning. There it was, in a corrupt agent's own careful hand, across 2 decades, the reclaiming of a strip of grazing, the closing of the water's road, and the flood that followed, and the ditcher blamed to bury it. "You cut my sluice gate," the Duke said to Hulme. His voice did not rise, which was worse than if it had. "You filed it in the dark so the storm would finish what your ledgers began. You'd have drowned the Holt a second time and 40 families with it, to sell my land out from under me and take your cut of the price." He looked at the man a long moment. "Get off my ground. You'll answer for the gate to the magistrate and for the rest to God, but you'll not answer for it here." "Go," Hulme went. He went through a crowd that opened for him the way water opens for a stone, and closed behind him just as cold, and the county watched the land agent walk off the estate he had tried to bury, and no one lifted a hand or a hat to him. And the Duke of Aldermere turned to Jonah Drayne. He crossed to the old broken ditcher in front of them all, and he took off his own hat, bareheaded before a man his family had ruined, and he said, 20 years my house let you carry a thing that was never yours to carry. My father's agent buried the water's road, and let it kill my brother, and let your name take the blame for it. It ends today." Before all these witnesses, Jonah Drayne mapped the water true. Jonah Drayne warned them. The record will say so. The blame is lifted, and it was never yours. And the old men of the fen, the ones who had crossed the lane for 20 years, who had turned their backs on the ditcher's cottage, who had let a child grow up under a name that was a stain, those old men took off their hats, one, and then another, and then the whole line of them, bareheaded in the morning, uncovering to Jonah Drayne. And Jonah stood in the gold field with his daughter's hand on his arm and wept a second time, and this time the whole county wept with him. There was one thing left, and it stood at the low end of the field where the water met the edge. Esther saw the Duke look toward it. She saw him understand what was left to do, and she saw what it would cost, and she started to speak, to tell him he need not, that the debt was paid, that no one asked it of him. But he had already begun to walk. He walked down the long holt toward the water's edge, down toward the low bank where the sluice ran out and the flood had risen 20 years ago and taken his brother. The edge he had not stood at in 20 years, that he had ridden around, kept the high line of, sent agents and experts to instead of himself, because he could not bear to put his boot to the thing that had taken his blood. He walked toward it now, in front of his aunt and the bank and the county and the girl from the bank in her pretty muslin, and every step was a year of it. He reached the edge. He stood at the water, and he did not drown, and it did not take him, and it only ran quiet and clean at his feet the way she had made it run. Then he turned, at the water's edge, and he held out his hand to Esther Drayne. "I have kept off this ground for 20 years, he said, so all of them could hear it. I let other men tell me what my own land was because I could not look at it. You would not let me look away. You climbed the bank to me every morning because you knew I could not come down. And you never once shamed me for it." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I'll not do the safe thing. I've done the safe thing for 20 years, and it cost me my land, and near enough my name, and it would have cost me you. Come up to the house, Esther. Not the service door, the front of it. Stay, and have me, and let them say what they will." Aunt Constance did not speak. Miss Ferrars, to her credit, only lowered her eyes and let a small true breath of relief go, for she had never wanted the draft signed either. The rules stood in the gold field and watched themselves yield in front of 40 families at the edge of the water where a duke had finally come down. Esther crossed to him. She took the hand. "I'll come up," she said, "but I'll come up as what I am. I'll not stop being the water's reader for any roof, yours or another's." "I'd not have you stop for the world," he said. "It's what I'm asking for." 6 months on, the long holt was green. The winter wheat came up thick along a field that ran dry now the year round, and the Fen families held their livings, and the drain her father drew ran clear from the west corner to the sea cut, quiet and living, the way water sounds when it is finally allowed to go home. The sluice was mended, good oak, no file marks in it now. Down at the cottage the porch caught the low winter sun, and Jonah Drayne sat in it, the man who first mapped the water, restored in the county record and in the county's mouth, no longer the ditcher who drowned a boy, but the ditcher who tried to save him and was not heard. The estate had a new office now for the draining of the wet grounds, and Esther Drayne stood at the head of it. On the mantel of that office sat her father's brass level. It had been a labourer's tool, a thing to be waved back to the ditch with. It was an engineer's instrument now, and men rode from 3 counties to have the water read by the woman who kept it. Prowse wrote once, from London, asking after the method, that he might present a paper. She sent him back a single line, and by all accounts he did not present the paper. "The water kept better books than you did, sir," she wrote. "It always did." That was all. And when the Dowager Constance came at Christmas, for she did come, in the end being old and having outlived the thing she thought would outlive them all, she stood in the green field beside her nephew's wife and said, stiffly, "I told you what people would say." "You did, my lady," Esther answered. "They said it." And the water went on running downhill regardless, the way it always has. And the old woman looked at the clean running drain a while and said nothing more, which for Constance of Aldermere was very near an apology. The water was never lost. That is the whole of it. It was never undrainable, and it was never cursed, and it never once needed an instrument from London to be understood. It was only waiting, under the reeds and the fill and 20 years of a lie, for someone who had been taught to listen to it. Her father taught her that, in a ditch, before she knew her letters. And it turned out to be the one thing worth knowing. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, if anyone ever waved you back to the ditch where they said your sort belonged, then you already know how this story ends. It ends with the water running true, and the right name on the record at last. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Comment your city. I read every one.